Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Envisioning Equity Part III, Reimagining the Criminal Legal System. We'll be getting started in just a moment or so. Thanks so much for tuning in. Once again, thanks everyone for joining for Envisioning Equity Part III, Reimagining the Criminal Legal System. We're going to be getting started in about 1 minute or so.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. I think you can all see and hear me. Thank you for joining us at our third in our Envisioning Equity series for 2020, Reimagining the Criminal Legal System. We're excited to be co-hosting this session along with our partner, the ACLU of Massachusetts. I'm Marie Francis Rivera, president of the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. And MassBudget is a leading think tank advancing policy solutions that create an inclusive and thriving Commonwealth for everybody. So during these Envisioning Equity community conversations, our aim has been to look at public budgets here in Massachusetts and the programs and the services that they support, and figure out how we can build racial and economic equity, particularly in communities that are hit hardest by a legacy of structural racism, disinvestment, and now COVID. This country and this state has been built upon racist ideas and racist policies that we must all work deliberately to undo every single day. Policies such as residential redlining, inequitable school funding, lack of access to GI Bill benefits, over-policing, and our punitive carceral system have brought deep harms to Black and Brown communities. And as an organization, we've committed ourselves to listening to and to centering Black, Indigenous, people of color voices, and also bringing our decades of expertise around economic and fiscal issues to help end racial oppression and white supremacy. And with the conversation around defunding police becoming front and center this summer after the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and many others, we thought it critical to bring together voices to make sure that what we're funding through our state budget is just, equitable, and anti-racist. And equitable investments are critical. So how we spend and we raise our public dollars is the clearest picture of our shared values. Our budgets on the federal, on our state and municipal levels are the most concrete expression of our collective vision for the society that we all want. And it's really about investing in policies and programs that bring collective well-being and joy, and divesting from what's harming Black and Brown communities. And to give us a sense of scale as we're jumping into this conversation with our esteemed and accomplished panel of experts, I'll show us quickly a quick look at our state budget. This pie chart is the totality. And we currently spend around $3.2 billion directly in the category of law enforcement and public safety. And the biggest subcategory in this is prisons, probations, and parole, where we spend about $1.6 billion a year. And at the local government level, we have data from 2017 that shows that in addition, we're spending about $1.7 billion additionally on the local level that goes almost all to policing. So today we have our panel of justice seekers who work with women and girls and those most harmed by the system that we currently have in place. And that'll bring various perspectives on the challenges of policing and the carceral legal system, and bring their insights on how we can make anti-racist policy choices that'll really make our society more just for everybody. And we truly believe that we can be a beacon of anti-racist policy change here in the Commonwealth, and that we all collectively have the power to reimagine really what an equitable world looks like. So again, MassBudget is co-hosting this event with the ACLU of Massachusetts, which is a private nonpartisan organization that has more than 80,000 supporters across the Commonwealth, more than 100,000 online activists, and is a state affiliate of the National ACLU, which defend the principles that are enshrined in the Massachusetts Declaration of Rights, as well as the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And we're truly honored to be hosting this important conversation with them. And today we're joined by Rahsaan Hall, who's the director of the Racial Justice Program at the ACLU of Massachusetts, who will help us lead us through this conversation about how we radically rethink these systems. So I'll do a quick introduction of Rahsaan and then pass it over. So as I mentioned, Rahsaan's the director of the Racial Justice Program at the ACLU, and in his role, he's helped develop an integrated advocacy approach to address racial justice issues. And this approach includes legislative advocacy, litigation, and community engagement to really address the issues that deeply impact communities of color and other historically disenfranchised communities. Prior to joining the ACLU, Rahsaan was the deputy director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice. And his work there included advocacy and community outreach, as well as litigation. And he's also served as the assistant district attorney in Suffolk County. And in addition to leading the ACLU's racial justice program, he also serves on the Himes Foundation Board of Trustees and is an ordained reverend in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And with that, I will pass it over to Rahsaan.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Marie Francis. It's on behalf of the ACLU, we are honored and pleased to co-host this with you and look forward to a partnership of really working together to get to that place of equity that we are working on now to re-envision. So this conversation shouldn't be an entirely new one as it relates to the disproportionate impact of people of color, particularly Black and Brown folks in our criminal legal system. We know that people in our communities are disproportionately targeted by the police. They are treated more harshly by the criminal legal system and are incarcerated for longer and longer terms. A recent Harvard study came out that looked at trial court data that showed, in fact, that Black and Latinx people accused with crimes are more likely to receive lengthier sentences and dispositions or be held on bail. And so even though the legislature in Massachusetts has attempted to respond to some of the concerns about racial injustice in this system and the cries and demands for justice in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor by initiating legislative reforms on policing. Both the House and the Senate have passed bills to address some of these inequities, but they remain stuck in the conference committee right now as they're trying to iron out the differences between those two bills. And even if those reforms were to be passed, we know that that would not address how through our state and local budgets, we maintain this system of policing and incarceration and harms to many of our communities. And so we're going to spend the rest of our time together thinking about how anti-racist public budgets can be reallocated and what targeted investments could be made to build stronger and safer communities. So we're going to hear first from Suffolk County District Attorney Rachael Rollins about how she is directing funding or redirecting funding away from prosecuting low-level crimes. We'll then hear from Andrea James, founder and director of Families for Justice as Healing, who advocates for abolition of the carceral system for women and girls and to reinvest those funds in strengthening our communities. And then finally, we will have Leon Smith, who will discuss the improvements to the juvenile justice system and the school discipline process. And so first, I would like to ask DA Rollins to speak directly to how her office is redirecting resources away from prosecuting certain types of low-level crimes to resources that can better benefit the community. But before I do, I want to briefly introduce her. Rachael Rollins, who I've known for quite some time when we went to law school together, is the Suffolk County District Attorney for that encompasses Boston, Chelsea, Rivera, and Winthrop. She oversees an office of approximately 300 people, handling approximately 35,000 cases each year, new cases rather, each year. She took office at the start of 2019 and as the first woman to be elected to that position in Suffolk County history and the first woman of color to ever serve as a Massachusetts district attorney. She's been a trailblazer in presumptively not prosecuting minor misdemeanors that were often caused other challenges within a community, for focusing on unsolved homicides, for protecting immigrant victims of ICE, and for revolutionizing the way that police-involved fatalities are reviewed in the Suffolk County DA's office by committing to an outside panel of investigators for every police-involved fatal shootings. So, District Attorney Rollins, when you first heard Marie Francis talking about budgets as a statement of our collective values, what are the policy and program decisions or directives that you have developed that are at best anti-racist or at least less carceral? And if you could please provide some examples of how you are redirecting resources away from prosecuting many low-level offenses to programs that help communities or other initiatives or plans that you have.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for letting me be part of this conversation. One of the first things I did was create a position called the Chief of Innovation and Strategy. We, make a conscious decision to not increase our footprint. One of the things that I think progressive DAs do, it's a flaw, is that we believe, well, we're good and progressive. I'm Black. I have people that I love, siblings that have cycled in and out of the criminal legal system. I understand everyone's issues. Now I need to be even bigger than I was. We are very aware of the fact that the community that elected me wants me to make my office footprint much smaller, right? Not increase the number of ADAs that I have, or say now I need 17 social workers in my office. No, what I need to do is be a very large, loud voice to say the community needs a program where they can have either, an entity that we can divert people to that has nothing to do with the carceral system and has people that are experts in these fields telling the criminal legal system, butt out, right? Because as you know, Rahsaan, many of the problems that bring people into the criminal legal system have nothing to do with the police or prosecutors, right? We don't get to choose who we are born to, which dictates where we live, what school we go to. So, none of the 198 participants on this call got to choose, Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie or Regina King as their parent, right? If we did, we'd all probably be in very different circumstances than we are right now, right? We might have fallen into good luck, right? Of wealth, privilege, living in a place with green spaces that has access to healthy food, right? Not Flint, Michigan, where you are drinking lead every day. Or, for example, when we look at Chelsea and all the environmental racism we have there, right? Tobin Bridge, Logan Airport, largest private food distribution center with hundreds of 18-wheelers driving through it. So I think about those issues very differently and make sure that I am not increasing, right? When I'm told we need 30 new assistant district attorneys in our class, I say, no, we don't. We can do this with 20 or 22, right? And I get it. There might be people on this panel that I respect deeply that said there should be 0. Okay, I can hear that too. But I promise you there's not 30, and we're not trying to increase our footprint. We're trying to decrease it. So that's number one. Number two, of the budget that Marie Francis just showed us, that wonderful position I just told you about, my Chief of Innovation and Strategy, Bobby Constantino, just sent me a text immediately that said, and make sure that you say that the SCDAO, Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, budget of that 3.16 billion, we are 0.6% of that budget, right? So my footprint of that law enforcement budget is very, very, very small, and we are aware of our footprint. So what do I do differently than the people that had the 15 men that had the job before me? One of the things, and asset forfeiture is an entirely different discussion that we will talk about, civil asset forfeiture in particular. But I inherited an office with a kitty, a coffers of several $100,000 in asset forfeiture funding that had been seized from the community, okay? And the office I inherited frequently gave out $40,000 or $50,000 a year. And the places that received all of that money, or the overwhelming majority of it, were Charlestown, South Boston, and West Roxbury. All important places. I have family members that live there. They have issues for sure in those neighborhoods, and they are all part of Suffolk County, but exclusively all part of Boston. What I did was look at, where are my violent, serious crimes happening? Where is the harm happening in my role as the DA? And the places that those are happening, to the tune of 71% of the non-fatal and fatal shootings and the non-fatal and fatal stabbings in Suffolk County, which is not just Boston, it's Chelsea, Winthrop, and Revere as well, happen in Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan. So what I did was I doubled the amount of money we give back to the community. I gave grants of up to $10,000. This last year, we gave out 21 different grants. And then when we saw that certain community organizers had never had to go through an RFP or an RFQ process or respond to a grant, proposal, we said, we're going to also train you on how to respond to these grants. So what we do, Rahsaan, is, who am I giving my money to? So we doubled the amount and we gave it to communities that had been left out. So Chelsea, Winthrop, and Revere were also part of that process. And then we gave it to a lot of different organizations within the trifecta of places where most of our harm, our violent, serious crimes were happening. And then, where do I spend my money? Every decision I make matters as the DA. Where am I buying, before COVID, when we would have meetings, when our car would get serviced, we have a fleet of 30 plus cars, right? Who are we contracting with? I want money going into Suffolk County. right? Not just us prosecuting people in Suffolk County. How many people in my office work in Suffolk County? When we have a job opening, where are we posting those jobs? Are we in the Banner? Are we in El Mundo? What are we doing to make sure that we're getting community members involved? And then we also, last but not least, we have held ourselves out there. We have Vera coming in to do a top to bottom audit of our policies and any of the implicit bias and explicit bias and racism that we might have coursing through our office, because we are a system as well. So we're willing to be held accountable, not just by our community partners, not just by our community, but by people that disagree with me or agree with me. That's irrelevant. We want to be transparent because our office belongs to the people, because we're paid for by tax dollars. And, you know, there are 185,000 people that believed in me and what I said prior to getting here. So I have to make sure I'm true to my word.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And, you know, from shrinking the footprint to distributing funds differently, and to spending the funds differently, I think that matters. And one of the things that I've always appreciated about you is how you use the platform to shift the narratives about what prosecutors do. And so now I'd like to move on to our next panelist, and we'll come back later for an additional questions for the DA and our other panelists. To Andrea James, who has been a leader for the abolition of police and incarceration. And I'd like to ask her to speak to what can be put in their place to create strong communities. But before I do that, I'd like to briefly introduce her as well. Andrea James, who is someone else that I've known for a long time, dating back to my days at Northeastern Law School when we were classmates. She is the founder and executive director for the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, and the founder of Families for Justice as Healing, and the author of Upper Bunkies Unite, and other thoughts on the politics of mass incarceration. She's a 2015 Soros Justice Fellow and a recipient of the 2016 Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award. As a former criminal defense attorney and formerly incarcerated woman, Andrea shares her personal and professional experiences to raise awareness of the effects of incarcerating women on themselves, their children, and their communities. Her work is focused on ending incarceration of women and girls and contributing to the shift from a criminal legal system focused on police and prisons to a system led by directly affected people from within their communities and based on individual and community accountability. And so, Andrea, if you could please talk about some of the things you are working on now that could benefit from more resources that are currently going to the carceral system. Also, what are the other community needs that should be funded instead of the carceral system?
Well, thank you, Rahsaan. It's great to be here today and to have our voices included in this really very important conversation that I do truly believe that everybody here on this call is earnestly working towards something different and something better. Our organization here is Families for Justice as Healing. It's an organization that is led by incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women and girls. And we advocate on behalf of women and girls unapologetically. I'm a former criminal defense lawyer who was sentenced in 2010 to serve a 2-year federal prison sentence for wire fraud. And I assure you that having that experience, in addition to what I already believed in, significantly transformed my thoughts about the criminal legal system that exists, not only in the Commonwealth, but in this country. We started to organize in that prison, and that was the result of our organization, Families for Justice as Healing. And we mean that title, that name, describes what we mean. It's not Families for Justice and Healing, it's Families for Justice as Healing. How do we get to that place of actually providing the resources and the things that folks need to begin to heal and advance their lives? We know that if we begin to build thriving communities, a lot of the harm that continues to be caused in our neighborhoods will dissipate. the more that people are provided with opportunities to not just struggle and survive, but to actually thrive. And so we did a 20-year budget look back. And just in a very cursory way, we could see glaringly the absolute austerity in investment in Black and Brown communities, particularly in Suffolk County. We learned also that from Nubian Square, formerly Dudley Square, for people who aren't aware that we've renamed it, to the Franklin Hill, Franklin Field housing development is the most incarcerated corridor in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And Rahsaan, as we've tried to build out these pieces of our long-term work going forward, that has been named Reimagining Communities through a people's assembly process, where the people get to decide where they're gonna go and how it's gonna get done. We realize that in years, for decades, there has been significant and increasing annual funding in police, including the Boston Police Department's BRIC and gang unit that are up in our communities. That has been a significant and annual increase in funding to the Suffolk County jails. We have 2 of them here already that are crammed full of young Black and Brown people from our neighborhoods that make up the most incarcerated corridor in the Commonwealth. And there's been an annual and regular and consistent increase in the Department of Correction, albeit we have no idea what that money is being spent on, including the suggestion that we need a new women's prison here in the Commonwealth. And so when you think about reallocation of resources, and regardless of what you may think about, I've been described recently as off-putting for making a recommendation of reallocation of funding police to moving those resources, those fiscal resources, into community for projects that are created and led by the people who have been most entangled in the criminal legal system. Whatever your thoughts are around defunding police, I'm sure you have to at least pause when we tell you that in the same decades that there has been this significant, massive increase annually in funding these police jails and prisons, and almost zero funding and investment in our young people, particularly up here in this Humboldt Avenue corridor and the corridor up Warren and Blue Hill Avenue, that's a travesty. That's an injustice in itself. We cannot let the gang unit be the answer for the issues that we're dealing with in our communities. We've got to invest in our young people here. We have absolutely no place in these neighborhoods for our young to meet, for us to organize with them. All of the land has been passed out to white developers. And so we're struggling, but we've turned our struggle into change, and we're building alternate systems of individual and community accountability, something that I really got to understand after not only being a criminal defense attorney, but becoming an incarcerated woman myself, Rahsaan, where I recognized that going to prison really does nothing to help a person with their individual accountability, nor with developing a sense of community accountability. And so we're doing these things under Reimagining Communities to build these alternate systems from within our communities to help us to do this work. Everything from transform harm to participatory defense, to participatory budgeting, to economic development, and a number of other things.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And thinking about that austerity that has had such a significant impact on our communities, but then organizing in community and mobilizing to reimagine what communities can look like is something that I think is truly important. And I've always admired and respected the work that you have done on the front lines on behalf of the most directly impacted people. So now I'd like to turn to Leon Smith, who will look at issues that DA Rollins and Ms. James have spoken about and how they intersect with juvenile justice. But before I turn it over, I want to briefly introduce Leon. He is the Executive Director of Citizens for Juvenile Justice, an organization that advocates for structural reforms for equitable youth justice. Leon has worked as a trial attorney in the juvenile justice system, first in Providence, Rhode Island, then at the Committee for Public Counsel Service in Roxbury, and later at his own law practice devoted to juvenile and criminal court advocacy. He moved to the Rivera Institute of Justice in New York City, working on youth-oriented local and national policy issues. Leon also served as the director of the Racial Justice Project, leading a team providing legal representation to youth of color subjected to harsh school discipline, illegal school pushout, and unconstitutional targeting by law enforcement. So Leon, I specifically like to speak to school discipline and arrests and the posting of school resource officers, or that is police, in our schools. How is the money spent on SROs, or school resource officers? How is that contributing to the criminalization of predominantly Black and Latinx children? And how can that money be better allocated to solving the underlying issues facing many of our schools today?
Thank you so much, Rahsaan, and thank you all so much for having me. So in beginning, I want to really uplift what Marie Francis said, in that a budget is really a statement of our values. When you look at the amount of money that we sink into school policing, and you contrast that with the lack of resources that we place into school-based supports and services for our young students, especially those in poor and diverse districts where children are often coming in the door having experienced trauma and adverse childhood experiences, which make it a challenge for them to be able to learn, where they really need those. When you look at where we're putting our money and where we're not, it really creates a clear picture that in Massachusetts, we care more about surveilling and controlling our young students, particularly students of color, more than we really care about giving them the supports, services, and resources that they need to really thrive and become their best selves. At CFJJ, we recently released a report called Fail: School Policing in Massachusetts. And when we looked at the data and the research, it became very clear that the placement of police in schools absolutely contributes to targeting and criminalization of young people of color. In Massachusetts, Black and Latinx students make up only 27% of all students, but are 64% of the school-based arrest. When you overlay gender with race, we see that we are at a crisis point with our Black girls, where, in credit to Mass Appleseed, who recently did this report in conjunction with their fellow Appleseeds in Kansas and Alabama, where in Massachusetts, Black girls are 5.5 times as likely to be suspended and 4 times more likely to be arrested than white girls, numbers that are far worse than they are in even Alabama. So it does happen here, and it is damaging to our young people. And one piece of the research that really brought this home is when we looked at focus groups with actual SROs, where they admitted that the line between behavior that is considered the subject of just other interventions or school discipline versus what requires a law enforcement referral or arrest was incredibly blurred and varied from school to school and district to district, with those districts that are poorer and more Black and brown having that more punitive effect. So at the end of the day, we are taking an approach where we are investing money in an institution, in the police, that is leading to this criminalization. But there's really 2 areas in which this is really damaging, not just to us now, but will be damaging into the future. And one is placing police in schools and placing this financial investment there. It really undermines the ultimate aim for why we have our young people in schools. We send our kids to school to be able to stay in class and learn, to graduate, and then to move on either to higher education or to career. Well, when you look at where the money goes, schools where federal school policing grants went, we see that those schools had higher rates of school exclusion, because when you have police in schools and that looming threat of being able to go and get the SRO is there, it ends up creating a more punitive environment, but also lower graduation rates and lower rates of students matriculating to college. So when you go to the heart of our education system, it's creating worse outcomes, worse outcomes that when you're talking about students not graduating high school and dropping out, we understand that that creates a lifetime of bad outcomes for our young people, greater likelihood of prison and unemployment and lower earning capacity. So we're taking young people in schools, which should really be the springboard to a better future. And by putting them in these punitive environments, we're really compromising their future. But the other point, and this is one I really want to drill home, and it gets into one of the arguments in support of SROs that I just flat out find offensive. And it's when people say things like, well, they're not really a police officer, they're more like a counselor or a social worker. One, that's a lie, because they don't have the education or the experience to be a social worker or a counselor. And by putting forth that justification and going along with it, you're justifying the blatant underinvestment in funding, in hiring, in training actual social and emotional and behavioral supports that our young people need. As I mentioned, you look at some of our districts that have a lot of school-based arrests, you also see that their special education budgets are strapped and stretched. And you see that they have nowhere near the number of social workers and counselors that they should have. So we've made this conscious choice towards control over supporting and serving our young people. And we really need to reverse course. We need to really stick to our values. And if we really care about Black and Brown students and helping our students, that whole conversation around divesting and investing funding, we have to center the needs of our young people and our children, who really are our future, the very first in that.
Thank you so much, Leon. These are all such compelling points, and it's heart-wrenching when we think about the lack of investment and this notion that police are going to somehow provide our children the things that we need. Speaks to the very problem that we're dealing with. And so I'd like to ask each of the panelists the same question. So maybe if you all could take maybe 2 minutes to answer this question, and I'll start with Andrea, then go to you, Leon, and then end with Rachael. But the question is, what does an anti-racist future look like when we think about policing and the carceral system? So Andrea, you can take that first.
Wow. Well, I think to start with, it means ending the use of prisons. I mean, we are an abolitionist organization. We do our work through an abolitionist framework. We are all people who have lived in prisons and know about how and the many ways that they cause further harm. It means ending of the separation of mothers from their children, which is just as incredibly painful as anybody could imagine due to incarceration. It means the end of the denial of voting rights for people who have been convicted of felonies, and the millions of Black people who are permanently still disenfranchised from the right to vote, having served their sentences, having done their time. And it means addressing the child welfare system. Thank you, Leon, for addressing the issue around the expulsion of Black girls, but also we work closely with Monique Morris and the Black Women Justice Institute, and what they have taught us about these things, along with Family for Movement Power, about the intersection of the child welfare system, which just in incredible ways mirrors the criminal legal system. I'll just end here by mentioning people spend a lot of time focusing, rightfully so, on the 1994 Crime Act and how it has affected our communities, and building a prison every 10 days in this country as a result of that. But nobody pays attention to the Adoption Safe Family Act, which grew out of that same era and has caused more disruption and more harm to Black mothers and their children in our communities as a result of it. And so these are the things that we could just begin to chip away at. Clemency. We have women in Massachusetts, one of the smallest populations of incarceration in the country. We should be a shining model for what ending incarceration of women and girls looks like. Because in a state with the numbers this small, we can do it. We can do it. We have the—
What are those numbers, Andrea?
They're tiny, 150 women sitting in MCI Framingham. I mean, it's outrageous. the small number of women sprinkled into our county jails, and the reasons why women are invisible in the criminal legal system, which is why we do the work that we do. And because we are the backbone of our communities, even prior to the increase in our incarceration. And 85% of us, Rahsaan, were the primary caretakers of our children prior to incarceration. That means something. That has a direct and immediate impact on the health and well-being and the ability of our communities to thrive. And so we have some real concrete solutions that we could implement today to bring an end to the racism that is just intricately baked into the system. We don't believe that there's a legitimacy in this criminal legal system because it is built on a platform of racism. And so those are some of the things that we would love to be a part of saying, here's what different looks like.
Yeah, thank you. Leon, what's the anti-racist future look like for you when you think of policing and the carceral system?
Thank you. One where we're brave and bold enough to really reimagine what things like safety and what justice really mean. It also means that we have to stop holding on for dear life to things that we know are not working. You look at our adult criminal justice system and you look at how it fails emerging adults and older teenagers. We're talking about a 76% recidivism rate as far as rearrangement and a 55% reconviction rate. Because taking these young people who, yes, they may be 18 or 19, but they're still developing and that adult system isn't working. Whereas you contrast what we're doing with developmentally appropriate services in the juvenile justice system, that falls to 22%. We have the number and the data and the facts to show that there's a better way of doing something. We need the boldness to reimagine it. We also need to understand that young people will make mistakes, but those mistakes should not stay with them for the rest of their lives. It is shameful how limited expungement is in this state. And we have to expand access, especially for incidents that happen before a young person is 21. The fact that we have young people who are doing well and trying to raise families in their 30s and 40s, and they still run into hiccups based upon youthful mistakes is inexcusable. And the last thing I would say, and Andrea really touched on it, is that school to prison pipeline and that trauma to prison pipeline, which is what we call that child welfare. When our young people, when our children are young and they've clearly been through traumatic experiences, we have to get them the social, emotional, and behavioral supports and mental health supports they need right then when they need it. Because when those children flow through and go into our juvenile justice system and into our criminal justice system, that's our failure as a system because we didn't get them what they needed.
Thank you, Leon. DA Rollins, anti-racist future.
So I think, hearing the quote, police provide our children what they need. I love pushing back and saying, right, for Black people, because in Wellesley, if you marched into Wellesley Public Schools or Wellesley High School or Lexington High and said, instead of this, Rhodes Scholar that's teaching them English, we're going to get 3 Black police officers to come in and question them and push them around all day. Or if West Roxbury woke up and every one of their police officers, or Waban or Winchester or Wellesley or one of our W towns in Massachusetts, all their police officers were Black and their kids were getting FIO'd every day, Governor Baker's phone would melt because the calls would be so many, as would the mayor, and it would be changed instantly. But when it's our community, we're just supposed to take this. I think an anti-racist future in law enforcement starts with the admission that slave patrols are what we started our police departments based on, right? If we aren't willing to have very uncomfortable conversations, and they're not uncomfortable for me, like I now say to people, your ignorance is not my problem. You want to get mad at me when I say something about a slave patrol that you don't believe happened, or you just learned about the Tulsa race riot because you watch Watchmen or Lovecraft Country. That's how you learned about it, but not because you had a Black parent or went to a school or learned your history on your own. Don't be mad at me. Go back and find your principal. Go back and find your headmaster if you went to, a private school like I did, and yell at them. I don't have time for this. So I feel like we have to start having very hard conversations. And then, Leon, you are 100% right. My office clings, not just clings, is strangling, holding onto bad decisions that people that aren't even them made from this office. I had a meeting today with my integrity review internal committee, right, about somebody where people were hypnotized. I'm not making up this word, hypnotized, and then testified that, yes, before hypnotism, I don't know who did this. Andrea James, stop it. I don't want my name on something like that, right? And the fact that we as a law enforcement entity, and I am part of that, and I have to remind myself every morning that I'm, us versus them. I'm a them now. I'm always us too, right? But I chose to jump into this job to dismantle from inside. Andrea's out here, Rahsaan's out here, Leon's out there from the outside dismantling. I chose to jump the fence and start working as hard as I could to change things internally. But if we don't admit that we can make mistakes, we can never get past where we are. I heard something recently where like upwards of 80% of people, and I said this stat can't be right, but it is, who are serving time for a felony have touched at one point the DCF system. To Leon's point, that is a complete failure, not of their parents, not of their guardians, because they didn't have parents and guardians that could either, based on trauma they have experienced or erroneously removed from them by a system that thinks that we aren't capable of raising our own children. Whatever the reason is, if they were raised in a system by the system and then come out worse and are violent, that's not our community's fault. That is the system's fault. That we need to be able to have those tough conversations and say, and this is, I will give a shout out to Andrea. She is creating, not just talking about a problem, but saying, and Rachael, we now have a brick and mortar facility with the skilled individuals necessary so that we can hold that individual that your office is telling you too dangerous, have to go to jail, have to go to jail. Rahsaan and I have this conversation all the time. I might not be an abolitionist yet, but I will say, you bet we don't need any more prisons. I think we can, and jails, we can absolutely close some down. I don't want any more money going into that. But until we get to the point where we're an abolitionist, where we are abolishing this, and remember, for people that think that's crazy, Rahsaan Hall once told me, people wanted to abolish slavery and everyone thought they were crazy. And luckily that worked. Well, sort of, right? Like, so, but you hear me, right? Like,
Right,
I think
right.
we need the Andrea Jameses of the world to say, Rachael, here is the solution. I'm not just going to say what the problem is. Send her to me because she has a bed here. She has trained people that can help her with the trauma she's experienced or whatever outbursts might be happening or violence. And I can go back to the court and say, we want this individual, instead of being sent here, to be sent to this facility.
And so an anti-racist future is Families for Justice's healing. I love it. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Marie Frances to engage with some audience questions.
And thank you all. Thank you all. And there are many questions, but I'm going to pick one that I think flows with what we've been talking about. And this is from Alexander. So Alexander says, as a community organizer, I'm working with a statewide organization and its members to review and weigh in on the police reforms that are currently in front of the State House, so if anybody wants to speak to that. But Alexander says, I'm very intrigued with DA Rollins' concept of creating a completely new entity responsible for the social well-being of at-risk individuals. What would this entity look like? I think we started having this conversation pretty organically. And where would it fit in respect to the existing fields of police and social work? So I think that question could go to Andrea, could go to DA Rollins or Leon, whoever wants to jump in first.
If I could just say, like, I want you to hear me say that the criminal legal system is being asked to do too much, right? Just like I believe police are being asked to do far too much, right? And so, part of when we talked the first question about like my footprint or being anti-racist, the biggest thing I do is decline cases. Like, the biggest way I've changed is we have a 280% increase in the number of charges that we decline. My predecessors used to decline about 1,000 cases a year. I decline 4,000 cases a year. So hopefully, like the work we are doing, you can't put your finger necessarily on that. Bobby Constantino, my chief of innovation and strategy, we are now collecting data to say, look at what we're doing, right? And contrary to what my opponents or like people who disagree with progression might say, according to the Boston Police Department, crime is down in Boston 5%, Chelsea 5%, Revere 17%, Winthrop 1%. I know that's not a lot, but it didn't go up, right? And so I think when I reimagine what these systems look like, my reimagining is I'm not in it, right? Leon and Andrea are the ones that are thinking about ways that our youth, without government oversight, without us putting them on probation, putting them in DYS, making their families, have to show up at appearance after appearance after appearance after appearance, taking the day off of work, getting babysitters, doing all this other stuff, breaking up families. I look at the future as these two people and me not involved in it at all.
Thank you. Andrea, Leon?
Well, I think our work around, or that's rooted in people assembly, the power of people assemblies. We went down to Jackson, Mississippi. There's a beautiful model of this that is being led by Rachael Lumumba and her brother Chokwe Lumumba. Chokwe is the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. His father was the mayor prior to his premature demise, and Chokwe has stepped into that position. And Mayor Lumumba Sr. really began to teach our communities a long time ago about a people's assembly process. And so when people ask about, first of all, abolition is not something new. It happens every single day in wealthier white communities. I was very privileged with education. I come from parents who were educator activists. I was sent to some of the best schools my entire life. A very elite private school here in Milton, Massachusetts. And I'm going to tell you something. The same issues that those young people.
BB&N is better. Anyways, no, I'm just joking.
Okay. Well, okay. We can have that conversation. But the things, the young people there were met with abolition principles. And they went on to become the folks that attended, the elite institutions that people who graduate and have wealth are afforded. And going to those schools every day and coming back home on the bus to my neighborhood of Roxbury and to Humboldt Ave, the young people in my community began to go to Harvard Street and to other places where children were sent to jails. And so abolition is not something, I want people to just breathe a little bit. Just breathe. Don't be afraid of this, because we have examples of it in a lot of places. And for us, this is, really about creating alternate systems. We know that prisons and jails aren't going to close their doors tomorrow. Okay, we know that. And at the same time, though, we know that we are simultaneously working to create systems that really, through a people's assembly process, teach transformative justice, teach about what does it mean? What does harm look like in our communities? What do we do now to address the harm? And what should we be doing that will actually get to the root cause of why people cause harm to another human being? And until and unless we begin to do that, and to do it from within the very neighborhoods, led by the people who are at the end of that violence and the end of that harm, we're never really going to begin a process of creating that change. And so when people say, does that fit into the current system? Well, actually, no, it's something very different. it's a new way of thinking. It's a new way of really addressing the issues that cause people to cause harm, that cause poverty, that cause lack of educational opportunities, all of those things. And so that's what we're doing. And it's really hard work. It's really, really hard work, but we stopped talking about it and we just put one foot in front of the other and started to say, in these very hyper-local pockets in our neighborhoods that are deeply entangled in the criminal legal system, what does different look like? And can we create some models of that today and stop talking about it? And so that's what we're doing.
Just very quickly to add on, we have to let go of the idea that these many diverse issues that people are having in our communities can all be solved by one entity. Police cannot be the single sole end all be all solution to everything. We're in the place that we are because we expect them to be police and mental health professionals and school psychologists and social workers and counselors and mentors. Reimagining means saying like, okay, let's actually have greater mental health supports and psychologists and mentors and social workers and counselors in our communities. As Andrea said, let's address those underlying issues people have. Let's make people better. And then in and of themselves, you're reducing a lot of these incidents and you're beginning to create that more positive future just by shifting your investment from a one-size-fits-all solution, which doesn't work, to a multi-tiered solution, which actually can.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you all. So we're right at time. So I'm gonna close this out, but I'm gonna actually ask Leon and Rahsaan to share a little bit about things that they're working on just to close. But just want to say thank you. Thank you to Rahsaan. Thank you to DA Rollins for taking the time. Thank you, Andrea and Leon. And what I'm thinking right now, what I'm feeling is that, the message loud and clear about we need investments that are going to bring well-being to people. That's, and also, and something that I've been feeling is we need urgency from our policymakers to move some of these things forward, whether it's on the investment side or whether it's on the reform side. People are hurting, communities are hurting, and time is ticking. So I wanted to give, as we close out, just Leon and Rahsaan just a minute to share some of the legislative work that they're doing really quickly. And just so you all know, we're going to be sending out this recording, some of the resources that were mentioned, of all of the organizations that you all lead that are doing such great work. So I'll pass it over to Rahsaan really quickly just to talk about some of the police reform work, and then I'll give Leon a minute to talk about some of the juvenile justice pieces.
Thank you so much, Mary Frances, and again to MassBudget for the ability to partner and do this work. One of the things that Black leaders in Massachusetts have been doing is organizing around making sure that this police reform bill that's being considered is as strong as it possibly can be. We know that it is not an abolitionist bill. We know that ample funding is still going to policing, but we're approaching it as a harm reduction method to really put some measures in place that can hold police accountable. And so Black leaders from over 50 organizations have signed onto a letter. That letter has been turned into a change.org petition. We have a draft script for folks to send to the conference committee members, as well as a letter for folks to send to their legislators and some social media tweets to really raise awareness about the need for this legislation to pass. So I will drop a link in the chat that folks can get more information, sign the petition, and contact the conference committee members.
And very similar from us, cfjj.org/take-action. It's an opportunity to get involved not only around the broader issues of policing that Rahsaan just mentioned, but also around specific pieces of the currently pending legislation on policing in schools, as well as other key youth justice reforms around the need for better juvenile justice data broken out by race and ethnicity so that we can really get a sense of the level of disparity in our system, as well as raising the age to better serve our older teens and expanded expungement for incidents happening before the age of 21. So please, our information is there, and you'll find scripts and information there if you want to get involved as well.
Marie, can I just add one thing? So the
Yeah.
legislature can do work on its own, and as we've seen, sometimes is very, very slow. There are Supreme Judicial Court cases that change things very quickly as well. So Dianchenko was a case out of Suffolk County that raised the age of what a juvenile was. So there were juvenile lifers that now had the opportunity to go before parole. We have an opportunity coming up. There's been a lot of publicity about my position to say I believe in actual science and people's brains developing beyond their 18th birthday. We have that coming up right now as far as that brain development piece. And I just would hope that people also know that in Boston, which I'm aware is not the whole state, Mayor Walsh had his task force that he just agreed to all of their proposals. And we have 3 Boston city councilors, Councilor Campbell, Councilor Mejia, and Councilor Arroyo, who are making some proposals to change some of the things that the Boston police are doing. And I have announced that we are gonna hold them to a much higher standard regarding their bad behavior and what we turn over to the criminal defense bar. So that's our Brady list, not Tom Brady. It's US v. Brady, an sort of exculpatory evidence, our discovery requirements as prosecutors. We are doing a lot of work, and this is the autonomy I talked about. We don't have to wait for the legislature to do this. I can say moving forward, if you want to be in Suffolk County and testify in our cases, you have to turn this information over to me or you can't any longer. So we're trying to change things too on the ground as well.
Appreciate that, and just your bold leadership in calling things out when they need to be. So,
And
Rahsaan,
lastly, pass the no-cost call bill.
yeah, do you want to talk about that for a
Keep
minute,
families
actually?
connected. Just keep families connected. We cannot continue to gouge families to communicate with their incarcerated loved ones. I know personally how difficult that is. We have a bill pending, S-2846, no-cost call. It's not right. Families should not be paying
We've supported it.
jails and prisons. So let's cut it out. The phone calls should be free. Children should be able to communicate with their mothers and their fathers. It's unconscionable. So let's just get the dang bill passed.
Here,
Thanks.
here.
Here, here. Okay, so we're gonna close out all of the pieces of legislation, resources. We'll make sure to send those all out. And we had many questions, and we were only able to get to one from the audience. But you know, our hope at MassBudget is that we can keep this conversation going so that we're really able to tangibly build and reimagine collectively together how we can really stop the harms that are happening in Black and Brown communities in the Boston area and in Massachusetts overall. So I don't know if there's anything, Rahsaan, that you want to say to close us out.
Other than just on behalf of the ACLU of Massachusetts, we're proud to partner with MassBudget on this, and we look forward to the continued work. I think this, you all's leaning in on this is really going to make a difference. And there's a lot of work. Thanks to the panelists for your willingness to share and participate in this process and start this conversation, because this is a beginning.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all for the hour. We really appreciate it. You all take good care.
All right, take care.